Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm speaking from sunny Yorkshire, which is just as well because this attic room where I'm speaking from is freezing when it's not sunny. And I'm very, very happy to be chairing this panel, which looks to be very interesting indeed. We're going to Asia this morning, and we're at that time in the history of the British Empire, the sort of twilight period, when British rule is beginning to end. It ends in Burma, and it ends in India. And obviously, the British suffered heavy defeats at the hands of the Japanese in Southeast Asia during the war. But all our speakers are focusing on the aftermath of war. And the last speaker is talking about the colonial war in Malaya in the late 1940s, early 50s, which is another feature of the end of empire in this area. So what does the RAF have to do with all this? Well, David Omissi probably needs a little introduction from me for most of you. He's published very, very widely on the history of the British Empire, particularly India, particularly the Indian Army. And his wonderful book on Indian soldiers' letters pioneered study of war from their perspective. There's also an article that he wrote about Indian soldiers in hospitals in Britain during the First World War that I go back to again and again. Really memorable article for me, that was. So David this morning is going to be talking about the RAF and not the Indian Army. So I'll pass you on now to David.
Right, hello. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. The RAF in the Royal Air Force in India and Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1948. Many thanks for that introduction, and thanks to Harry for inviting me. Now, this period was one of transition, particularly, as we've heard from other papers, this is particularly true of India, of course, which was making the transition from war to peace and from the British Raj to independence and demobilisation. Institutionally, from a predominantly RAF for the Royal Indian Air Force, self-partitioned between India and Pakistan. Although the period is quite short, it does contain distinct episodes. The period from period up to VJ Day, when the war in the Far East continued. The reassertion of colonial authority in Vietnam and Netherlands East Indies, and a period of uncertainty surrounding demobilisation and India's political future, 1945 to 1946, ending in 1947 with the creation of Pakistan and the Indian airlift to Kashmir. I've not been to any archives for obvious reasons in the last 6 months, so I've relied heavily on published sources. One I think is not very well known, that's a memoir by an RAF other rank called Raf and Raj, by Jack Loveday, and I'll be talking a little bit about him. It's based on his diaries, letters, and other ephemera during his time in India from 1945 to 1947. Now, of course, as we know, the Air Force in the Far East was fairly forgotten at home. When Loveday got to India, he noticed that letters arrived quickly, newspapers came much more slowly by sea, and when he read these British newspapers, it became clear to him at once that there was very little space devoted to the war in the Far East. He realised why the 14th Army was called the Forgotten Army. The film Burma Victory, made by an army film unit, arrived in Southeast Asia around the same time, and it showed very little recognition of the role the RAF had played in the victory. One thing I did notice when I went to the Yorkshire Air Museum, well, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight does commemorate the bomber offensive, D-Day, and the Battle of Britain, of course. When I went to the Yorkshire Air Museum, I noticed there was a Dakota which had served in Burma, but it was painted with D-Day invasion stripes. Churchill's demi-official history, his memoir, Second World War, also plays down the war in the Far East. So let's look first at the period to VJ Day. The advance on Mandalay and Rangoon was very dependent on air support. Slim was confident, Slim, the commander of the 14th Army, was confident He could call up air support. This was closely coordinated with movement on the ground. They used the cab rank system that had proved effective in Normandy, and a number of squadrons were equipped with the Thunderbolts in Burma, one example of which you can see in the museum downstairs. They did use some dive bombing using the Vultee Vengeance, originally designed by the Americans for the French, but this was withdrawn in favours of fighter and fighter bombers and heavy bombers, possibly reflecting the RAF's institutional prejudice against dive bombing. The most distinctive aspect of the war in Burma, according to Slim, was the great use we made of air transport. In February 1945, Sir Keith Park, officer commanding the air in Burma, agreed to supply Slim's 14th Army, nearly 300,000 men, from the air during its advance on Rangoon. There's also important use made of medical evacuation and air ambulances, although all of this was hampered by the withdrawal of all American aircraft from Southeast Asia by the 1st of June 1945. All of the above, of course, was predicated upon Allied air superiority. This was a long struggle. The Japanese in 1942 had more and better aircraft and better tactics. This situation was reversed in 1943-4, and Allied air superiority over the whole of Burma was no longer challenged after June 1944. There are several reasons for that. One was the importance of the development of early warning to enable Allied fighters to climb to height in time. Mobile early warning was not always very effective in Burma, however, because of the speed of the Allied advance, which made it difficult to keep up, and because of the terrain, but it was eventually significant. Also, of course, it was the arrival of Allied aircraft, better Allied aircraft from late 1942. Most significantly, from the British and Commonwealth point of view, was the Spitfire, the Mark V of which became operational in India in September 1943. The Spitfires were fast enough to intercept the high-speed Japanese Dyna reconnaissance aircraft, thus depriving the Japanese army of crucial intelligence. Slim in his memoirs said, never has an army been better or more usefully or more gallantly served by an air force. And Sir Keith Park, in his dispatches, emphasised air supply and close RAF support. But this turned into a bit of a battle of the dispatches after the war, because the army wanted him to revise some of his claims, and they preferred to emphasise the importance of checking the Japanese invasion of India in 1944. But they managed to produce agreed versions. Now, the transition to peace in Europe involved the defeat, occupation and partition of Germany, dealing with displaced persons and German prisoners. There was a still more complex picture in Southeast Asia. At the Potsdam Conference of July 1945, Britain's Southeast Asia, Britain and the Commonwealth Southeast Asia Command was expanded to include the Netherlands, East Indies, modern Indonesia, and French Indo-China south of the 16th parallel, which became, of course, in future South Vietnam. This resulted in a massive increase in responsibility. And I want to talk about some of those responsibilities now and the role of air power. First, of course, there was the repatriation of Allied troops. Many British troops had served, British and Commonwealth troops had served continuously for 4 or 5 years in the East, often in terrible conditions, and they were desperate to get home. There were also many thousands of Allied prisoners, British, Australian, Indian, American, French and Dutch, who were, quote, starving and dying of disease in the brutal and barbaric prison camps. One of the most urgent tasks was the repatriation of Allied prisoners of war. There were also over 700,000 Japanese troops in British-occupied territory who had to be disarmed and collected. There was a shortage of transport aircraft. This particularly affected Britain with the end of the Lend-Lease system by which the Americans supplied transport aircraft to Britain. The RAF was also involved in suppressing anti-colonial movements in Southeast Asia, particularly in what had been Vichy Indo-China and the Dutch East Indies. Generally, the attitude towards the Dutch was more positive because the Vichy had been a collaborationist regime. The Labour government, although planning to withdraw from India, was intending to restore French sovereignty in Indo-China. There was a British and Indian presence there, and the Viet Minh claimed that this was merely cover for the French reoccupation. British and Indian troops were flown in to Indo-China to maintain law and order, ensure security, and liberate Allied prisoners. The RAF was used to support the French in Vietnam on a limited scale. One left-wing member of the RAF took part in security sweeps in the countryside around Saigon airfield. His servicing commando unit searched villages for terrorists, weapons and ammunition, and he later recalled despondently that the majority of the squadron saw nothing wrong in what they were being asked to do. Mountbatten was somewhat reluctant to do all this. He was shaken by the threatened use of airstrikes against the Viet Minh. A fairly similar situation pertained in the Netherlands, the East Indies. The Republic of Indonesia was proclaimed by the nationalists in August 1945. It established a functioning Indonesian government with a flag and an anthem, but the Dutch refused to recognise the new government, and the nationalists intended to resist the reimposition of Dutch rule. The Netherlands East Indies threatened to unbalance Southeast Asia Command's post-surrender planning. Mountbatten didn't particularly want to restore Dutch rule, but simply to restore law and order. But he had very little option but to increase British and Indian military involvement in the region. Dutch troops were not available until March 1946. Direct confrontation came with the nationalists in October 1946. Aircraft were used for shows of force, thunderbolts again, dropping leaflets describing Allied aims, but there were also some airstrikes from November 1946. The Indonesian nationalists, interestingly, had captured 27 serviceable Japanese aircraft and were prepared to use them. Now, all of this had significant political impact in India. The use of Indian troops and the use of bombing enraged the Indian National Congress, particularly particularly Pandit Nehru, who became the first Prime Minister of independent India. The Labour victory in July 1945 resulted in Clement Attlee becoming Prime Minister. Labour intended to solve the Indian problem, despite Ernest Bevin's commitment to empire. Loveday's memoirs, which I mentioned in the introduction, it suggests that there was, on the troop ship he was on, sailing out to India, there was widespread enthusiasm amongst the troops for the Labour victory. He was too young to vote at the age of 19, but he was, quote, politically aware enough to regard myself as a socialist. The coming of peace, he felt, came rather as an anticlimax. The war with Japan was now over, and this had been the main reason he'd been sent to the Far East anyway. The objective having been achieved, he wrote, his presence in India now seemed a waste of time. He recalled that once the war ended, we became virtually an army of occupation. Now, the RAF, of course, had become a massive force over the period of the Second World War. It didn't bring the same imperial and racial attitudes to India as, for example, the 1930s British regular army. Loveday makes some comments about his hatred of bull and square bashing, and he's very worried at one point when the 8th Gurkhas arrive on on his site that he's sharing with them in South India. Quote, "Their part of the camp now reeked of bull. We could hear morning reveille and other bugle calls. There was much marching. This quite appalled us, since we feared that all this military display might give our officers ideas, which was the last thing we wanted." Loveday's attitudes to Indians possibly contrasted with those of the regular British Army. Obviously, his Air Force. He showed some sympathy for nationalism. He had rather mixed attitudes to India. At times he hated it, but he loved life in the Himalayan foothills. He transferred to Visakhapatnam in South India in April 1946. He noted that the billets were much better. They'd previously been occupied by the Americans, and he thought the Americans normally cared more for the welfare of their other ranks than the British did. Loveday probably spoke for many of the RAF in Asia when he recalled that we became fed up, too discontented for our own peace of mind, and just longing to go home. And this desire, this resentment of the slow rate of demobilisation, poor conditions, and poor food prompted the RAF mutinies beginning in January 1946, involving up to 50,000 men, although the protests were peaceful. Keith Park wrote of these that the situation was better than 1919 by 90%. Loveday's speculated that one consequence of the RAF strike may have been the actions of Indian sailors in what became known as the Royal Indian Navy mutiny. Did the RAF give the RAN an example to follow, he thought. Lord Wavell, the Viceroy, also believed that the quote, "the example of the Royal Air Force who got away with what was really a mutiny had some responsibility for the present situation regarding the Royal Indian Navy." This may have affected his attitude to the Victory Parade of March 1946. In his diary, his diary is a great source for this period. He recorded that he was generally impressed by the parade, but thought that the flypast by the RAF was very poor. Now, when the Labour government was elected, British officials wanted to keep a strong, united India within the Commonwealth and within the imperial security system. India, of course, had been a major supply base in the Second World War. Elections were called, and the Muslim League became far more influential after 1946 than it had been before the outbreak of war. Aircraft are being used to police the northwest frontier from 1919, in northwest frontier of India in 1919, and this was still going on up to 1946 when, for example, one section of the Masuds kidnapped a political agent. Wavell wondered what he was going to do about this. He said, "I'm rather doubtful of our ability to do anything. Our resources available are 3 squadrons of Spitfires flown by Indian pilots. To expect an Indian pilot to fly low enough in a Spitfire in a narrow valley amongst those hills to hit the target is unduly optimistic. Spitfires obviously were not designed to fly through mountains." But the bombing of the Masud sections went ahead, and ironically, some of the Masuds were also serving in Calcutta during the disturbances of August 1946. And the Shabis Kel, they're the Masud section soldiers in Calcutta, knew that their family homes were being bombed, but he summarised their views as, "That is all right, our people have been naughty and are being justly punished, but what are you going to do to these Hindus of Calcutta for all the murders they have committed of Muslims?" And the Indian press got hold of the story and made quite a lot about this so-called brutal bombing by British troops, British aircraft in Waziristan. The whole internal security situation was becoming more difficult in this period. In February 1946, Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, reported that the RAF was not really organised for action for internal security. There were major disturbances in Calcutta in August 1946 compared with the linked to the Muslim League's Day of Action. These disturbances then spread to Noakhali and Bihar, rural areas of India. When Wavell toured Bihar, he interviewed 3 indignant and accusatory Muslim politicians who urged the use of air power against Hindus in the countryside. Machine gunning from the air is not a weapon one would willingly use, though the Muslims, from his diary, though the Muslims point out rather embarrassingly that we did not hesitate to use it in 1942 during the Quit India movement. Mountbatten was not the only politician prepared, Wavell, not the only politicians prepared to use air power for internal security purposes. Nehru, when Nehru learned that the princely state of Travancore in South India was in agreement with a foreign power over the disposal of the state's uranium deposit, he was not dispassionate about the issue and declared in a cabinet meeting that he would, in extreme, send the Indian Air Force to bomb Travancore. I'll now move on to look at the period from the Calcutta riots to the partition of India in 1947. Now, Mountbatten became Viceroy of India in February 1947, and he concluded very quickly that the cabinet mission plan for a united India, a united decentralised India, was dead. And in April, I think it was April, he presented a paper on the subject of the administrative consequences of the partition of India. At the end of April 1947, Evan Jenkins, the governor of Punjab, concluded that an agreed partition of Punjab was virtually impossible. Communal violence spread to Punjab in March 1947. Auchinleck had expressed the view that it would take from 5 to 10 years to effectively divide the Indian armed forces, and Jenkins was the governor of Punjab, believed that the announcement of partition would be followed by an immediate blow-up. He would need 4 operational divisions with an army headquarters to deal with the security situation in the event of partition. Mountbatten thought that tanks and aircraft would be needed, and the British cabinet approved maximum force, including the use of bombing. Mountbatten aptly told the cabinet that Mountbatten believed that the only hope of checking widespread communal warfare was to suppress the first sides of it gradually, promptly and ruthlessly, using for this purpose all the force required, including tanks and aircraft. Mountbatten considered that the partition of the Indian armed forces was going to be by far the most difficult issue to get agreement over, and Auchinleck, when presenting a plan, warned that during the process of partition, India would be virtually undefended. The partition of the armed forces inevitably involved the partition of the Royal Indian Air Force, which was only 10 squadrons strong in 1946. This is a particularly complex operation because in the Indian Navy and the Air Force, there were no wholly Muslim or Hindu units. All classes and creeds were inextricably mixed in all arms trades and establishments. The government of India had long recognised that, so creating 2 separate air forces was going to be extremely difficult, to do quickly. Air defence considerations also made it important to keep Pakistan in the Commonwealth. The government of India had long recognised that the Indian armed services would require a quota of British officers until there were enough suitably qualified Indians to completely fill all grades. And this was true of the Indian Air Force as well. Many years, it was thought by a leading Indian group captain, would elapse before India could develop an independent aircraft industry and experimental establishments. At present, he said, the Royal Indian Air Force could not stand on its own 2 legs. So it's not surprising then that when India became independent in August 1947, Mountbatten and Nehru both asked Air Vice Marshal Sir Thomas Elmhurst to become the first Commander-in-Chief of the new Indian Air Force. Mountbatten also emphasised the importance of India remaining in the Commonwealth for the purpose of procuring British and American military aircraft. He didn't want the the Indians to acquire aircraft from the Soviet Union. Partition was announced on the 3rd of June, and British policymakers had not achieved their goal of a united India within the Commonwealth defence system. Now, partition was accompanied by widespread communal violence in August. Despite his claims made in May, Mountbatten didn't hold back from using air power to police the rural violence in Punjab. He didn't want to use aircraft because it would have been a confession of the gravity of the situation in the Punjab. The decision not to use aircraft has been described as otherwise inexplicable. He wanted independence to look like it was a gracious transfer of power. The Punjab Boundary Force did have one squadron of Tempests, Hawker Tempests, with it, but they were not used to in a ground attack role. Now, Pakistan, it had been frequently argued, was unworkable from a financial, economic and military perspective. Pakistan could not maintain an effective defence of the northwest frontier. It would need external support or would become vulnerable to Soviet pressure. Pakistan was particularly vulnerable to air attack. Bases in Pakistan could not be out of the range of enemy bombers, and Karachi and Lahore were vulnerable to air attack. The Americans wanted both as bases for operations against the USSR, and the weakness of the Pakistan Air Force at first was a concern. There was also a huge refugee problem, and India requested a loan of American aircraft to evacuate non-Muslim refugees from Peshawar. Truman refused to supply the aircraft. Mountbatten remained on as Governor General of India, and he had to deal with the fact that the Hindu Maharaja of Kashmir, which was 77% Muslim in population, acceded to India, and Pashto irregulars, covertly supported by Pakistan, moved into the province. Access by the Indian Army was impossible by road or rail in the time available, and so Indian Army troops were airlifted to Srinagar to defend Hindu Kashmir. The order was given by General Lockhart, another British officer who'd stayed on as the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian armed forces. So to conclude then, the history of the RAF is often conceived as a history of aircraft and air power. We've seen from the papers yesterday it's much more than that, but the close air support in Burma in 1945 does fit into this picture. But the history of the RAF in India and Southeast Asia was much more than this. It was intimately bound up with the history of British and European decolonisation. It includes matters like race relations and social and political change. The impact of the attempted restoration of European rule in some parts of Southeast Asia on politics in India, the continuance of air policing, characteristic of the 1920s and the 1930s, the fact that the RAF was entangled in the decolonisation process and was affected by it, the willingness of Muslim politicians to ask for aircraft to suppress disturbances, and also the partition of assets. The partition of assets was a microcosm of the wider problems of partition of assets, particularly financial assets. Now, Mountbatten held back for political reasons for using air power in the during the August massacres. Using air power could not be dismissed as mere policing in the way that sending in British or Indian troops could be. Bombing people was never going to look like restoring order. There was a lot of concern about the weakness of the new state of Pakistan, not least in the air power context of the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. We need also to consider the social history of the RAF in India in this period and the experience of the RAF other ranks. I'd like to close with a reference back to Jack Loveday and his memoir Raf and Raj. Maybe he's not typical. Maybe the memoir published in 2002 had the benefit of hindsight. Maybe his memoir was more politically correct than he was at the time. But in his memoir, he recalled his hatred of RAF service, not least because he wasn't getting demobilised quickly enough. But this mellowed with time. And I'd like to end by saying he perhaps spoke for many in the RAF when he said that his RAF service had been, quote, my university. All right, thanks.